At 80 years old, Margareth had lived a life full of triumphs and heartbreaks, but nothing prepared her for what was about to unfold. She wasn't just any woman. She was someone who had tasted fame, love, and loss in ways that would break most people. Yet, here she stood, ready to open her heart once more, finding comfort in the company of a young nurse who seemed to understand her like no one else had in years. It was a second chance at happiness, something she thought she'd lost forever. But there was something unsettling that lingered in the air. Was this love real, or was there a darker truth hidden beneath the surface? The glances, the subtle questions about her past, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. There was something he wasn't telling her. As Margareth's heart opened wider, so did the door to something far more dangerous than she ever imagined. And once she discovered the truth, everything would change. Would she fall victim to the ultimate betrayal? Or would Margareth take control of her destiny in a way no one could predict? What happens next will leave you breathless and questioning everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and second chances. The grand ballroom of the sprawling Westbrook estate in New York's affluent Hamptons stood silent, a stark contrast to its glorious past. Margareth Westbrook, once the toast of high society, now shuffled across the polished hardwood floor, her frail 80-year-old frame a shadow of her former grace. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the ornate windows, Margareth's weathered hands traced the outline of a dusty gramophone. With trembling fingers, she lifted the needle, desperately hoping to hear the familiar crackle of an old record. But like everything else in her life, it remained stubbornly silent. Closing her rheumy eyes, Margareth could almost hear the phantom strains of Strauss's Blue Danube. In her mind's eye, she saw herself twirling in the arms of her late husband, Charles, their movements fluid and passionate. The memory was so vivid she could almost feel the swish of her beaded gown against her legs and smell Charles's signature cologne. But reality crashed back as her arthritic knee gave way, nearly sending her tumbling to the floor. Catching herself on a nearby chair, Margareth's gaze fell upon a faded photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a younger version of herself, radiant in a shimmering gown, posing with Frank Sinatra after a charity gala in 1962. A solitary tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek, carrying with it decades of loneliness and loss. The vast emptiness of the mansion seemed to close in around her, a gilded cage that held nothing but echoes of a lifelong past. Suddenly, the shrill ring of the doorbell pierced the silence, startling Margareth from her reverie. Her heart raced, a mixture of fear and hope coursing through her veins. Who could it be? It had been weeks since anyone had called, her so-called friends having long since abandoned her to her solitude. With faltering steps, Margareth made her way to the grand entryway. Her gnarled hands fumbled with the heavy brass lock, finally managing to pull open the massive oak door. There, silhouetted against the fading daylight, stood a young man in crisp blue scrubs. His kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he offered a gentle smile. "Mrs. Westbrook?" he inquired, his voice warm and reassuring. "I'm John from Hamptons General. I have some follow-up paperwork from your last visit." Margareth blinked in surprise, her mind struggling to recall any recent hospital visits. But something in John's demeanor put her at ease, and she found herself inviting him inside. As John stepped into the foyer, his eyes widened, taking in the faded grandeur of the Westbrook mansion. His gaze lingered on a wall adorned with photographs, Margareth in her prime, dancing with presidents and movie stars. "My word," he breathed, genuine awe in his voice. "Mrs. Westbrook, these photos are incredible. Were you a professional dancer?" A spark of long-dormant pride flickered in Margareth's chest. "Oh yes," she replied, her voice quavering with emotion. "Charles and we were quite the talk of the town in our day. We danced for charity, raised millions for children's hospitals and veterans' homes." John listened intently, his paperwork forgotten as Margareth began to recount tales of glittering ballrooms and star-studded galas. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, truly heard. As the stories flowed, John's eyes never left Margareth's face. There was something in his gaze, a mix of fascination and something else, something Margareth couldn't quite place. "Mrs. Westbrook," John said softly as she paused for breath. "I hope this isn't too forward, but would you allow me to accompany you to your future appointments? It's clear you have so much more to share, and I'd be honored to listen." Margareth felt a flutter in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in decades. Was this handsome young man truly interested in the ramblings of an old woman? Or could there be more to his offer? As John awaited her answer, his eyes darted briefly to an ornate safe partially visible through a nearby doorway. The movement was so quick, Margareth almost missed it. But in that fleeting moment, a seed of doubt was planted. "That's very kind of you, John," Margareth replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Perhaps we can discuss it next time." As she showed him to the door, Margareth's mind raced. Could this be a chance to recapture some small part of her past glory? Or was John just another vulture, circling what remained of the Westbrook fortune? The door closed behind John, leaving Margareth alone once more in the cavernous entryway. She leaned heavily against the polished wood, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. In the fading light, Margareth's gaze fell upon her reflection in a nearby mirror. The face that stared back was lined with age and sorrow, but in her eyes, a tiny spark had reignited. For better or worse, it seemed the final act of Margareth Westbrook's life was about to begin. As night fell over the Hamptons, the Westbrook mansion stood silent once more. But within its walls, the echoes of a long-forgotten waltz began to stir, carrying with them the promise of one last dance. The Westbrook mansion's imposing silhouette loomed against the backdrop of a crisp autumn morning in the Hamptons. Inside, Margareth sat in her sunroom, absently stirring a cup of Earl Grey tea, her mind still swirling with thoughts of yesterday's unexpected visitor. A gentle knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "Mrs. Westbrook?" John's voice called softly. "It's John from the hospital. I hope I'm not intruding, but I brought those forms I forgot yesterday." Margareth's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to return so soon. With trembling hands, she smoothed her silver hair and called out, "Come in, dear." John entered, his smile as warm as the sunlight streaming through the windows. Today, he wore casual clothes instead of scrubs, and Margareth couldn't help but notice how handsome he looked in a simple sweater and jeans. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," John said, his eyes taking in the room's faded elegance. "Not at all," Margareth replied, gesturing for him to sit. "I was just reminiscing about the old days. Sometimes that's all I have left." John's expression softened with genuine concern. "Mrs. Westbrook, if you don't mind me saying, I think you have so much more than just memories. Your life sounds fascinating. I'd love to hear more about it, if you're willing to share." For the next hour, Margareth found herself opening up to John in a way she hadn't done in years. She told him about her whirlwind romance with Charles, their rise in New York society, and the glittering parties they'd hosted in this very house. John listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and laughing at all the right moments. As Margareth spoke, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest, the joy of being truly heard and appreciated. "You know," John said during a lull in the conversation, "I've always been fascinated by the history of the Hamptons. The old money, the scandals, the secrets. I bet you've seen it all, haven't you, Mrs. Westbrook?" Margareth chuckled, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Oh my, you have no idea, dear. The stories these walls could tell." John leaned in, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "I'd love to hear them someday, if you're comfortable sharing, of course." As he spoke, John's gaze flickered briefly to a painting on the wall, a stunning Monet that Margareth knew was worth millions. The movement was so quick, she almost missed it, but that seed of doubt from yesterday took root a little deeper. Margareth smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Perhaps another time, John. An old woman must keep some secrets, you know?" John nodded, looking slightly disappointed. He stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Mrs. Westbrook, I hope you don't think this too forward, but would you allow me to stop by regularly, just to check on you and maybe help out around the house a bit?" I hate to think of you all alone here. Margareth felt her heart flutter. Part of her yearned to say yes, to grasp at this unexpected connection. But another part, hardened by years of disappointment, held her back. That's very kind of you, John, she said carefully. Let me think about it, and we can discuss it next time. As John left, Margareth couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just transpired. She made her way to her bedroom, her steps a little lighter than they had been in years. Opening her closet, Margareth pulled out a dusty photo album. Inside were snapshots of a life lived to the fullest: glamorous parties, exotic vacations, and most precious of all, quiet moments with Charles. Her fingers traced the outline of her late husband's face. "Oh, Charles," she whispered, "what would you make of all this? Am I a fool to hope at my age?" As she closed the album, Margareth's eye caught the gleam of the safe hidden in the back of her closet. Inside lay not just her considerable fortune, but mementos of a life well lived, and secrets that could destroy reputations even decades later. Margareth sighed heavily, the weight of her years settling back onto her shoulders. She'd learned long ago that in the Hamptons, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. And yet, as she drifted off to sleep that night, Margareth's dreams were filled with waltzes and laughter, the ghosts of her past mingling with the possibilities of tomorrow. In the vast Westbrook mansion, a tiny flame of hope flickered to life, casting shadows that danced like memories across the walls. The autumn sun had long since dipped below the horizon, casting the Westbrook estate into deep, velvety shadows. Inside, Margareth sat at her vanity, carefully applying a touch of her favorite Chanel lipstick. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes sparked with an excitement she hadn't felt in years. A gentle knock echoed through the cavernous hallway. "Mrs. Westbrook?" John's voice called out. "Are you ready?" Margareth took a deep breath, smoothing her silk blouse. "Coming, dear," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. As she descended the grand staircase, Margareth saw John waiting at the bottom, looking dashing in a simple suit. His eyes widened as he took in her appearance. "Mrs. Westbrook," he breathed, "you look absolutely stunning." A faint blush colored Margareth's cheeks. "Oh, this old thing?" she laughed, gesturing to her carefully chosen outfit. "I just threw it on." John offered his arm, and together they made their way to Margareth's beloved Rolls-Royce, a 1965 Silver Cloud 3 that had been Charles's pride and joy. As they drove through the winding roads of the Hamptons, Margareth felt a thrill of anticipation. "I can't believe I let you talk me into this," she said, a mixture of nervousness and excitement in her voice. John smiled warmly. "Sometimes we all need a little push to reconnect with the things we love. And from everything you've told me, dancing was your greatest passion." They pulled up to the Starlight Ballroom, a once glamorous venue that had seen better days. As they entered, Margareth's heart sank. The place was nearly empty, with just a handful of couples swaying to the tired tunes of a small band. "Oh, John," Margareth sighed. "It's not at all how I remember it." John squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Close your eyes, Mrs. Westbrook. Listen to the music. Feel the rhythm. The magic is still here, if you look for it." Margareth closed her eyes, letting the melancholy strains of Moonlight Serenade wash over her. Suddenly, she was transported back in time. The room filled with phantom couples, the men in sharp tuxedos, the women in flowing gowns. She could almost smell the mixture of expensive perfumes and cigar smoke that had once permeated the air. Without opening her eyes, Margareth stepped onto the dance floor. Her body remembered the steps, muscle memory taking over as she began to sway and turn. In her mind, she was dancing with Charles again, young and vibrant, the toast of New York society. John watched from the sidelines, a complex mix of emotions playing across his face. Admiration, certainly, but also a flicker of something darker, guilt, perhaps, or conflict. As the song came to an end, Margareth opened her eyes, breathless and flushed. The illusion shattered, and she found herself alone on the empty dance floor, tears streaming down her face. John rushed to her side. "Mrs. Westbrook, Are you all right? Margareth nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I'm fine, dear. It's just, for a moment I was young again. I could feel Charles's arms around me, hear the applause of the crowd. Oh, John, I miss it all so terribly. John's expression softened. You're an extraordinary woman, Mrs. Westbrook. Your life, your experiences, they're like something out of a movie. I feel honored just to know you. As they made their way back to the car, John hesitated. Mrs. Westbrook, I hope this isn't too forward, but would you join me for dinner? There's a little place nearby that I think you'd love. Margareth paused, that seed of doubt from before flickering to life once more. But looking into John's earnest face, she felt her reservations melt away. I'd be delighted, John, she said with a smile. As they drove to the restaurant, John's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it, a flash of worry crossing his features before he silenced it. Is everything all right? Margareth asked, concerned. Oh, it's nothing, John replied, perhaps a bit too quickly. Just some work stuff, nothing that can't wait. But as they settled into their cozy booth at the restaurant, Margareth couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to John's mysterious message than he was letting on. The candlelight cast flickering shadows across his face, and for a moment, Margareth thought she saw a glimpse of inner turmoil in his eyes. As John raised his glass in a toast, Margareth found herself at a crossroads. Should she open her heart to this charming young man who seemed to genuinely care for her? Or was she setting herself up for heartbreak? Or worse? The clink of their glasses echoed through the quiet restaurant, a sound both hopeful and ominous. As they began to talk, Margareth steeled herself for whatever revelations the evening might bring, knowing that her next steps could change the course of her twilight years forever. In the distance, barely audible over the soft music of the restaurant, a clock struck midnight. The witching hour had begun, and with it, the true test of John's intentions and Margareth's wisdom was about to unfold. The soft glow of candlelight danced across the white tablecloth at La Petite Maison, one of the Hamptons' most exclusive restaurants. Margareth sat across from John, her weathered hands cradling a glass of 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild, a vintage that brought a flood of bittersweet memories. Charles and I visited the vineyard the year this was bottled, Margareth mused, her eyes misty with recollection. We were celebrating our 25th anniversary. Oh, the stories I could tell you about that trip. John leaned in, his eyes alight with genuine interest. Please, Mrs. Westbrook, I'd love to hear them. Your life sounds like something out of a Hollywood movie. As the evening wore on, Margareth found herself opening up more than she had in years. The wine loosened her tongue, and soon she was regaling John with tales of her globe-trotting adventures with Charles, from midnight tangos in Buenos Aires to high-stakes poker games in Monaco. You know, Margareth said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, Charles wasn't just a brilliant businessman. He had other talents, talents that made us very wealthy, but also put us in some dangerous situations. John's eyebrows shot up. Mrs. Westbrook, are you saying that Charles was involved in less than legal activities? Margareth chuckled, a mischievous glint in her eye. Let's just say that the contents of our safe would make for quite the scandal, even after all these years. The rich and powerful have long memories, my dear. As soon as the words left her mouth, Margareth felt a twinge of regret. Had she said too much? But John's rapt attention and sympathetic nods encouraged her to continue. You see, John, she sighed, that's why I've been so alone these past years. After Charles passed, I couldn't trust anyone. Everyone wanted a piece of the Westbrook fortune, but nobody cared about the woman behind it. John reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers. I care, Mrs. Westbrook. I hope you know that. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through Margareth. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe in the sincerity of his words, to hope that perhaps, in her twilight years, she had found a true friend. Suddenly, John's phone buzzed loudly, shattering the intimate atmosphere. He glanced at the screen, his face paling visibly. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Westbrook, he stammered. I have to take this. It's an emergency at the hospital." As John stepped away from the table, Margareth felt a chill run down her spine. Something in his reaction didn't sit right. With trembling hands, she reached for her purse, fishing out the pair of reading glasses she always carried. Squinting across the dimly lit restaurant, she could just make out John's figure in an alcove near the restrooms. He was speaking in hushed, urgent tones, his body language tense. "I need more time," Margareth heard him hiss into the phone. "She's starting to trust me. But if we move too fast, we'll lose everything." Margaretha's heart plummeted. The seed of doubt that had been growing since John's first visit suddenly blossomed into full-blown suspicion. Who was he really, and what did he want from her? As John returned to the table, his face was a mask of calm concern. "I'm so sorry about that, Mrs. Westbrook. Now, where were we?" Margareth forced a smile, her mind racing. Should she confront him? Play along? The wine that had loosened her tongue earlier now churned uneasily in her stomach. "Actually, John," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I'm feeling a bit tired. Would you mind terribly if we called it a night?" A flicker of disappointment crossed John's face, quickly replaced by solicitous concern. "Of course, Mrs. Westbrook. Let me get you home." The ride back to the Westbrook estate was filled with a tense silence. As they pulled up to the grand entrance, John turned to Margareth, his eyes searching her face. "Mrs. Westbrook," he began hesitantly, "I want you to know how much I've enjoyed our time together. I hope we can do this again soon." Margareth nodded, her mind whirling with conflicting emotions. "Thank you, John, for everything." As she watched his taillights disappear down the long driveway, Margareth felt the weight of her years pressing down on her. She had lived through war, scandal, and heartbreak, but never had she felt as vulnerable as she did in this moment. Making her way to her bedroom, Margaretha's gaze fell on the safe hidden behind her closet door. Inside lay not just the remnants of the Westbrook fortune, but secrets that could topple empires. With shaking hands, she dialed a number she hadn't used in years. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Frank, it's Margareth Westbrook. I need your help. I think I'm in trouble." As she hung up the phone, Margareth caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was no longer the naive socialite of her youth. In her eyes burned a fierce determination. Whatever game John was playing, Margareth Westbrook was not going down without a fight. The final dance had begun, and she intended to lead. The Hamptons' famous morning mist clung to the manicured lawns of the Westbrook estate, shrouding the mansion in an ethereal glow. Inside, John paced the guest house he'd been calling home for the past few weeks, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. "I told you I need more time," he hissed, glancing nervously out the window towards the main house. "Margareth is starting to trust me, but if we push too hard, we'll lose everything." The voice on the other end crackled with barely contained anger. "Time is a luxury we don't have, Johnny boy. The old lady's got secrets that could bury half of Wall Street. We need that safe combination, and we need it now." John ran a hand through his disheveled hair, the weight of his deception pressing down on him. I know, but there's something about her. She's not just some rich old lady. She's... Don't you dare go soft on me now," the voice snarled. "Remember why you're doing this. Remember Lizzie." The name hit John like a physical blow. "How is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's holding on, for now. But without that money for her treatment, well, let's just say the clock's ticking. For both of you." As the call ended, John slumped onto the bed, his head in his hands. How had his life come to this? Conning a sweet old lady out of her fortune? But then Lizzie's face flashed before his eyes, his little sister. So full of life, now wasting away in a hospital bed. A gentle knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. "John? Are you awake, dear?" Margaretha's voice sent a pang of guilt through his chest. Composing himself, John opened the door with a forced smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Westbrook. You're up early." Margareth stood there, impeccably dressed as always, a tray of coffee and pastries in her hands. I thought we might have breakfast together. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." As they settled onto the patio, the unease in John's stomach grew. Had she overheard his phone call? Did she suspect something? Margareth sipped her coffee, her eyes never leaving John's face. "You know, John, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation last night, about trust and loneliness and the weight of secrets." John's heart raced. "Mrs. Westbrook, I dash." She held up a hand, silencing him. "Please let me finish. In all my years, I've learned that everyone has secrets. The question is, what are we willing to do to protect them? Or to uncover them?" Her gaze hardened, and for a moment, John saw a glimpse of the formidable woman Margareth must have been in her prime. "I'm going to ask you something, John, and I want you to answer me honestly. Who are you really? And what do you want from me?" The world seemed to stand still as John's mind raced. Should he come clean? Stick to his story? As he opened his mouth to respond, his phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. Margaretha's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps you should get that. It seems quite urgent." With trembling hands, John pulled out his phone. The caller ID made his blood run cold. Hampton's General Hospital. I have to take this," he stammered, rising from his seat. Margareth nodded, her expression unreadable. "Of course, we'll continue our chat later." As John rushed back to the guest house, Margaretha's calm exterior crumbled. She pulled out her own phone, dialing a number with shaky fingers. "Frank, it's me again. I need you to dig deeper into John's background. There's something he's not telling me, and I think it might be connected to the hospital." Hanging up, Margareth gazed out over the misty grounds of her estate. The tranquil scene belied the turmoil in her heart. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, the thrill of mystery, the ache of potential betrayal, the faint fluttering of what might be love. Inside the guest house, John listened to the doctor's update with growing despair. Lizzie's condition was deteriorating rapidly. They needed to move forward with the experimental treatment immediately, or risk losing her forever. As he ended the call, John caught sight of his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him was a stranger torn between desperation and guilt, trapped in a web of lies that threatened to destroy not just him, but the unexpected connection he'd formed with Margareth. In that moment, John made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. He would tell Margareth everything about Lizzie, about the blackmail, about his initial intentions. And then, God help him, he would beg for her forgiveness and her help. As the morning mist began to lift, revealing the sprawling Hamptons landscape, the stage was set for a confrontation that would expose long-buried secrets and test the limits of trust, forgiveness, and love. In the game of hearts and fortunes, the final play was about to begin. The grandfather clock in the Westbrook Mansion's grand foyer struck noon, its deep, resonant chimes echoing through the cavernous halls. Margareth sat in her late husband's study, a tumbler of aged scotch trembling in her hand despite the early hour. Her eyes, usually warm and inviting, now held a steely resolve. Across from her, separated by a massive mahogany desk, sat John. Gone was his easy charm and boyish grin. In their place was a man haunted by desperation, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his deception. "So," Margareth began, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "would you care to explain why a supposed nurse from Hampton's General has been making calls to known criminals? Or why your background check shows more holes than Swiss cheese?" John flinched, his facade crumbling. "Mrs. Westbrook, I can explain dash." "Oh, I'm sure you can," Margareth interrupted, her tone icy. "The question is, will it be the truth this time?" She pushed a folder across the desk. Inside were surveillance photos, phone records, and a dossier that laid bare every lie John had told over the past weeks. "I may be old, John, but I'm far from foolish. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate you? That I'd just hand over access to my fortune because you danced with me and listened to my stories?" Tears welled in John's eyes. A mix of shame and anguish etched across his face. "You're right," he whispered. "I came here with the intention of conning you. But Mrs. Westbrook..." "Margareth," You have to believe me when I say that everything changed. My feelings for you, they're real." Margareth scoffed, but John pressed on, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "My sister, Lizzie, she's dying. There's an experimental treatment that could save her, but it costs more money than I could ever hope to earn honestly. When they approached me with this plan, God help me, I said yes." He pulled out his phone, showing Margareth a photo of a young woman in a hospital bed, her once vibrant features gaunt and sickly. "This is why I'm here. Not for myself, but for her. I know it doesn't excuse what I've done, but please, you have to understand." Margareth's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of empathy crossing her face, but it was quickly replaced by a hardened resolve. "You're right, John. It doesn't excuse what you've done. You've betrayed my trust, made a mockery of my feelings. For all I know, this sister of yours is just another lie." She stood, moving to the window that overlooked the sprawling Hamptons coastline. "I want you out of my house. Now." John rose, his legs unsteady. "Margareth, please. I'm begging you. If not for me, then for Lizzie. She's innocent in all this." Margareth turned, her eyes blazing. "Innocent? Like I was innocent when you wormed your way into my life? When you made me believe that someone could care for me, not just my money?" Her voice cracked, the hurt and betrayal finally breaking through her composed exterior. "Do you have any idea what it's like, John? To be alone for so long, to finally think you've found a connection, only to have it all be a lie." John stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "It's not all a lie. What I feel for you, it's real. It may have started as a con, but somewhere along the way, I fell in dash." "Don't you dare," Margareth hissed. "Don't you dare say you love me." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant crash of waves against the Hamptons shore. Finally, John spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What can I do to make this right? To save Lizzie?" Margareth turned back to the window, her reflection a mix of sorrow and steely determination. "You can leave, John, and you can pray that I decide your sister's life is worth more than my broken heart." As John reached the study door, Margareth's voice stopped him. "Oh, and John, if you ever come near me or this house again, I'll have you arrested faster than you can say con artist. Do I make myself clear?" John nodded, unable to meet her gaze. As he walked out of the Westbrook mansion for what he assumed was the last time, he felt the weight of his actions crushing down upon him. He had gambled everything, his integrity, a chance at true connection, and now, possibly, his sister's life, all for nothing. Back in the study, Margareth sank into her chair, the adrenaline of confrontation giving way to bone-deep weariness. She picked up the photo of Lizzie, studying the young woman's face. With a heavy sigh, she reached for the phone. "Frank, it's Margareth. I need you to look into something for me. A patient at Hampton's General named Lizzie. I think I might have one last wrong to right." As she hung up, Margareth gazed at the photos spread across her desk, images of her life with Charles, of glittering parties and secret rendezvous. And there, at the edge, a snapshot of her and John, caught in mid-laugh at the Starlight Ballroom. A single tear fell, blurring the image. In the game of hearts and fortunes, Margareth Westbrook had emerged victorious. But as the setting sun cast long shadows across the Hamptons, she couldn't help but wonder, at what cost? The Hampton sky blazed with the fiery hues of sunset, casting a warm glow over the Westbrook estate. Inside the mansion's grand ballroom, Margareth stood alone, her frail figure a stark contrast to the room's faded opulence. The air hung heavy with dust and memories. As if in a trance, Margareth approached the old gramophone in the corner. With trembling hands, she placed the needle on a scratched vinyl record. The first notes of Moonlight Serenade crackled to life, filling the room with bittersweet melody. Closing her eyes, Margareth began to sway. In her mind, she was young again, twirling in Charles's strong arms, the ballroom alive with laughter and champagne bubbles. But as she opened her eyes, reality came crashing back. She was alone, dancing with ghosts. A sound at the doorway startled her. John stood there, his face a mix of sorrow and determination. "Mrs. Westbrook," he said softly, "I know you told me never to come back, but I couldn't leave things like this. There's something you need to know." Margareth's eyes flashed with anger, but curiosity won out. "You have 2 minutes before I call security." John stepped into the room, his gaze never leaving Margareth's face. "I've turned myself in. To the police, to the hospital board, to everyone. I've confessed everything." Margareth's stern expression faltered. "But why?" "Because you deserve the truth," John replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And because I realized that no matter how noble I thought my reasons were, what I did to you was unforgivable." He took a tentative step closer. "But there's more. The experimental treatment for Lizzie, it worked. She's going to be okay." Margareth's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "How? I thought it was you, wasn't it?" John asked gently. "The anonymous donor who paid for her treatment." Margareth nodded, unable to speak. John's eyes shone with gratitude and something deeper, more complex. "Why?" he whispered. "After everything I did, why would you help her?" Margareth took a shaky breath. "Because, my dear, in my long life I've learned that love, real love, isn't about deservingness. It's about choice. And I chose to believe that somewhere, beneath all the lies, there was a grain of truth in what we shared." John's composure broke. Tears streamed down his face as he fell to his knees before Margareth. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed, "for everything. You're the most extraordinary woman I've ever met, and I ruined any chance we had." Margareth looked down at him, her heart a battleground of conflicting emotions. Slowly, she extended her hand. "Stand up, John," she said softly. "This may be our last dance, but let's make it count." As John rose to his feet, the music swelled. He took Margareth in his arms, and they began to move across the floor. Their dance was slow, tentative at first, but soon they found their rhythm. "I meant what I said before," John murmured as they swayed. "Somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. The real you, not just the wealthy widow I was supposed to con." Margareth's eyes met his, searching for truth. "And I meant what I said. Love is a choice, a terrifying, wonderful choice." As they danced, the years seemed to melt away. Margareth was no longer the lonely widow, and John was no longer the desperate con man. They were simply two souls, finding solace in each other's arms. The song began to fade, and with it, the magic of the moment. As the final notes died away, Margareth and John stood still, forehead to forehead, both knowing that everything had changed. "What happens now?" John asked, his voice barely a whisper. Margareth stepped back, straightening her posture. The regal bearing of a woman who had faced a lifetime of challenges returned. "Now," she said, her voice steady, "you go and face the consequences of your actions. You be there for your sister. You rebuild your life, honestly this time. And us." John's voice cracked on the words. Margareth's eyes softened. "Us? That's a chapter yet to be written. But John, know this, you have a long road ahead to earn back my trust. It won't be easy, and I can't promise where it will lead. But if you're willing to try," John nodded, hope blooming in his chest. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mrs. Westbrook. Margareth, I'll spend the rest of my life making this right if I have to." As John turned to leave, Margareth called out, "Oh, and John, next time you visit, and there will be a next time, bring Lizzie. I'd like to meet this sister of yours properly." John's smile was radiant as he nodded, then disappeared into the gathering darkness. Alone once more, Margareth returned to the gramophone. As she lifted the needle, she caught her reflection in a nearby mirror. The woman looking back at her was changed, older, yes, but with a spark in her eye that had been missing for far too long. "Well, Charles," she said to the empty room, a wry smile on her lips, "it seems our story isn't quite finished yet. I do believe we have one last waltz left in us after all." As night fell over the Hamptons, the Westbrook mansion stood silent but full of possibility. For Margareth, the final act of her extraordinary life was just beginning, and this time, she would lead the dance. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and new beginnings as Margareth Westbrook stood on the expansive porch of her Hamptons estate. Her eyes, sharp despite her advanced years, scanned the winding driveway expectantly. Today was no ordinary day. It marked 6 months since her last encounter with John, and the day she would finally meet Lizzie. As a sleek sedan pulled up, Margareth's heart fluttered with an emotion she hadn't felt in decades. Hope. John emerged from the driver's side, looking vastly different from the suave con man who had first darkened her doorstep. His designer clothes were replaced by a simple sweater and jeans, and a humbler air surrounded him. But it was the young woman who emerged from the passenger side that truly caught Margareth's attention. Lizzie, her face still bearing the pallor of recent illness but alight with life, stood uncertainly beside the car. "Mrs. Westbrook," John called out, his voice carrying a mix of nervousness and gratitude. "I'd like you to meet my sister Lizzie." Margareth descended the stairs with a grace that belied her age. As she approached, Lizzie stepped forward, tears glistening in her eyes. "Mrs. Westbrook," Lizzie began, her voice quavering, "I can't begin to thank you for what you've done. You saved my life, even after everything." Margareth took Lizzie's hands in her own, her touch gentle but firm. "My dear," she said softly, "in this life, we're all deserving of second chances. Some of us," she added with a pointed look at John, "perhaps more than others." John lowered his gaze, the weight of his past actions still heavy on his shoulders. But Margareth wasn't finished. "Come," she said, leading them inside. "We have much to discuss." In the grand living room, over tea served in delicate bone china cups, Lizzie shared her story. She spoke of her battle with a rare form of cancer, of experimental treatments and dwindling hope. And then, like a miracle, an anonymous donor had appeared, offering a lifeline when all seemed lost. "It was you, wasn't it?" Lizzie asked, her eyes searching Margareth's face. "You're the one who saved me." Margareth nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Let's just say I've learned that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. And sometimes the most worthwhile investments are in people, not stocks." John, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Mrs. Westbrook, Margareth, I've spent these past months trying to make amends. I've been volunteering at the hospital, working with other families facing what Lizzie and I did. I'm studying to become a patient advocate. I want to help people the right way now." Margareth studied him, seeing not the polished facade of before, but a man humbled and transformed by his experiences. "And what of your other associates?" she asked pointedly. John's expression hardened. "I've testified against them. They're facing charges now. It wasn't easy, but it was right." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Finally, Margareth stood, moving to the grand piano in the corner. Her fingers, gnarled with arthritis but still nimble, began to play a hauntingly beautiful melody. "You know," she said, her eyes distant with memory, "Charles and I faced our share of challenges. There were times when the temptation to cut corners, to take the easy way out, was almost overwhelming. But we always believed that true wealth, true happiness, comes from integrity." She turned to John and Lizzie, her gaze intense. "What you did was wrong, John. The pain you caused, it can't be undone with a simple apology." John nodded, accepting her words without protest. "But," Margareth continued, her voice softening, "what you're doing now, that takes real courage. It's not about erasing the past. It's about building a better future." Lizzie reached out, taking her brother's hand. "We both have a second chance now," she said. "Thanks to you, Mrs. Westbrook." Margareth's eyes twinkled with a mischievous light. "Well then, we shouldn't waste it, should we? John, I believe you once promised to help me relive some of my glory days. How about we start with a dance?" As if on cue, the first notes of Moonlight Serenade filled the air from hidden speakers. John stood, offering his hand to Margareth with a mixture of reverence and newfound authenticity. As they began to sway, Lizzie watching with tear-filled eyes, Margareth leaned in close. "You know, my dear," she whispered, "redemption is a beautiful dance, but it takes two to tango, one to lead and one to trust." John's arms tightened around her, understanding the weight of her words. "I won't let you down again, Margareth. I promise." As the sun began to set over the Hamptons, casting a golden glow through the windows, three souls, each marked by pain, loss, and the possibility of renewal, found themselves embarking on an unexpected journey together. For Margareth Westbrook, her final act was turning out to be her most daring performance yet. A dance of forgiveness, second chances, and the enduring power of the human heart to heal and love again. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of new beginnings, Margareth realized that sometimes the most beautiful dances are the ones we never saw coming. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.